William James is usually taught as a founding figure in psychology and as a key voice in functionalism. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is usually taught as a modern clinical approach grounded in learning principles, cognitive appraisal, and behavioral change. At first glance, these belong to different worlds: 19th century theory versus 20th century clinical protocols. But there is a serious academic bridge between them, not because James invented CBT and not because we should read modern therapy back into history, but because James helped establish a way of thinking about the mind that made later applied approaches more intelligible. The bridge is functionalism, the idea that mental processes are best understood by what they do, how they operate, and how they can be shaped through practice. To see the connection, it helps to define functionalism in a precise way. Functionalism is not simply the claim that the mind is useful. It is the claim that psychology should explain mental life in terms of functions: attention, habit, emotion, perception, choice, rather than treating consciousness as a static structure composed of mental atoms. James's stream of consciousness is part of this. Mental life is fluid, continuous, and selective. But functionalism is not only about describing flow. It is also about explaining how the organism becomes stable through repeated patterns of action and attention, and how those patterns can change. James's theory of habit is the most direct point of contact with modern applied psychology. He argues that habits are not superficial routines. Habits are the flywheel of human behavior. They conserve energy, reduce decision costs, and make action predictable. In James's language, habit carves paths in the nervous system channels through which behavior and attention begin to run automatically. This is not modern neuroscience, but it is a proto-model of what later people would call plasticity. Repeated action creates stable pathways, and stability can be reshaped by repeated practice. What matters for James is that change is not mainly a matter of insight. It is a matter of training. Practice makes pathways real. That emphasis aligns with a core CBT principle. Stated in modern terms, cognition and behavior are patterns, and patterns are modifiable through structured repetition. CBT is not simply think positively. At its best, it treats thoughts, interpretations, and behavioral routines as learnable responses which can be revised by changing cues, attention, interpretations, and actions over time. James's habit psychology provides a conceptual ancestor to this pattern approach. He does not offer worksheets or protocols, but he does offer the underlying view that minds are shaped by repeated selection and repeated action. James also insists that attention is an active factor in mental life. Attention is not merely what happens after perception. It is the selection that makes perception meaningful. This matters because many psychological difficulties, whether described clinically or not, are difficulties of selection. What someone repeatedly notices, what they repeatedly interpret as significant, what they repeatedly rehearse internally, and what they repeatedly avoid. CBT often focuses on these loops in a structured way, identifying automatic thoughts, examining interpretations, testing predictions, and modifying behaviors that reinforce distress. James's contribution here is conceptual. He makes attention central, and he treats the training of attention as a serious psychological act, not a vague moral recommendation. At this point, it is important to be historically honest. CBT does not come from James directly. It develops through multiple lines: learning theory, behaviorism, and later cognitive approaches that emphasize appraisal and interpretation. But James's functionalism helps explain why the applied turn makes sense at all. If psychology is about functions, then changing function becomes a legitimate question. If habits carve pathways, then practice becomes a legitimate mechanism. If attention is selection, then shifting attention becomes a legitimate target. In that way, James's framework can be read as one of the intellectual conditions that prepared the ground for later therapeutic models. Even if the direct lineage runs through other figures, the phrase "beyond structuralism" captures another important contrast. early approaches associated with structural analysis aimed to break consciousness into elements and describe its contents under introspection. James does not deny that analysis can be useful, but he thinks the deeper question is what these contents do within a life. Functionalism moves psychology toward adaptation, action, and the practical consequences of mental life. This shift naturally supports applied frameworks, because once you treat mental states as functional operations, you can ask how those operations can be reorganized. Structural descriptions alone do not tell you how to change a pattern. Functional descriptions can. The neuroplasticity bridge should also be handled carefully. James speaks in 19th century terms, but his underlying idea is compatible with a modern claim. Repeated practice changes the nervous system. The modern term plasticity gives biological detail and empirical support. But the conceptual core is the same. Stable patterns are built, and stable patterns can be rebuilt. In James's habit chapter, the key mechanism is repetition under attention. In modern language, repetition strengthens synaptic pathways and changes network dynamics. The vocabulary changes, but the logic of training remains. Now, why does this matter for a modern audience without turning into self-help? Because it clarifies what change means in psychology. Many people imagine change as a purely mental decision. You decide to think differently, and therefore you do. James suggests something more realistic. Change is a rechanneling of habit and attention, and that takes repetition. CBT, in a modern setting, operationalizes that insight into structured exercises and behavioral experiments. James gives the philosophical psychological foundation. The mind is not a static object. It is a set of operations in time, and operations can be trained. A disciplined conclusion, then, is that functionalism did not predict CBT in a simplistic sense, but it did anticipate a psychological worldview in which CBT becomes intelligible. A worldview where the mind is understood through function, where habit is a central mechanism, where attention shapes experience, and where change is conceived as training rather than as mere insight. That is why James remains relevant to modern psychology. He is not only a historical figure, he's one of the clearest early theorists of the mind as a system that can be shaped by practice, to an idea that sits quietly underneath many of the most influential applied approaches in psychology today.